If you want to gain knowledge and understanding, you need two things. The first thing you need, if you want to gain knowledge and understanding, is ignorance. Now, this may sound contradictory because knowledge and ignorance are understood to be opposites. But the truth of it is, you cannot learn something if you think you already know it. You cannot welcome a new truth or fact into your life if there is something already in its place. The guy who is credited with founding Greek philosophy, a guy named Socrates, did not go around ancient Athens telling everybody how much he knew and offering to explain to them what he knew. Instead, he proclaimed his own ignorance. And when he would be in a dialogue with someone about some aspect of life, his method was usually to ask questions in order to strip away the things that his conversation partner thought he knew, but which were only custom or superstition or assumption. And only when a person had emptied himself, become ignorant, could that person then start to gain knowledge or wisdom. So if you want to gain knowledge or understanding, you need to start with ignorance. But you need one more thing. In order to gain knowledge and understanding, you need love. And this may also sound paradoxical, because how do you love something that you don't know? But this is just to say that you have to care about the object you want to know. You have to draw near to it. You have to embrace it. I'll give you an example from my own life, a negative example from my own life. The last math class I took in high school was Algebra 3. And I did just fine in Algebra 3. I got A's or B's, I don't really remember, but I did fine. But I just didn't care about it at all. Apologies to any math teachers out there. But sines, cosines, cosecants, cotangents, who cares, I thought to myself. And so I would do my quizzes, and I did fine on my quizzes, I did fine on my homework, did fine on my tests, and then I forgot it all because I had never really learned it. I didn't care about it, I didn't love it. If I had been a more mature person, I maybe would have been able to understand, or at least be curious about the elegance and the beauty that is buried within this particular structure and form of knowledge, but I just forgot it as soon as I could. It disappeared from my memory, and lots of things have disappeared from my memory since high school, but trigonometry is one of those things that left without a trace. Didn't change my perception of the world in the least. So knowledge requires ignorance, and it requires love. If you want to understand something, you have to humble yourself before it. You have to acknowledge something there that is beyond your grasp. And you have to be patient with it, to pay attention until it reveals itself to you. Think about getting to know another person. You have to not assume that you know their whole deal already, that you can piece together a few details, a few experiences, and get a comprehensive picture. Because then what we do is we fill in the blanks. We fill in the blanks with assumptions or stereotypes or a projection of our own mind and experience onto the other person. And you have to care enough about that other person to pay attention, to let your perceptions change. Now, in our language, we call this combination of ignorance and love by the name curiosity. Without it, all the facts and the skill that we pile up are just an illusion. It's false knowledge. As the prophet Isaiah said, and as Jesus quotes in a curse, actually, from God, see and see, keep on looking, but do not perceive, do not understand. Hear and hear, keep on listening, but do not comprehend. So how do we begin not just to see, but to perceive, to understand? Well, the letter of James that we hear today has some wisdom on this point. Who is wise and understanding among you, says the apostle, show by your good life that your works are done with the gentleness born of wisdom. There is also a false kind of wisdom. This is the wisdom, James says, that's born of envy, ambition, and boastfulness. And this kind of wisdom, James calls earthly, unspiritual, and devilish. This is when we understand something about the world, but we use our insight without love for our own purposes. This is like learning about someone's habits and their needs and their likes and their dislikes for the purpose of manipulating them or getting something from them. On the other hand, what James calls wisdom from above is pure, peaceable, and our translation says willing to yield. I've decided to translate for that for myself as accommodating, willing to adapt, willing to adjust. It is merciful, and it is fruitful. In other words, don't assume you already know what you need to know. Do not seek to gain advantage by deploying your words and your wisdom and your insight and demonstrating your mastery. Don't use your insight as a weapon, but use it out of love. And if you need to prove something, prove it through your good works. Prove it through your kindness and your love. And then James goes on to tell us, draw near to God and he will draw near to you. Now this is controversial in the history of Christianity because it seems to suggest that God is passive, sort of waiting for us to approach him, rather than God actively drawing us to him through grace. So there's a whole controversy behind that line, and we'll get into that another time. But I think there's some real insight psychologically in what James says here. Do we want to know God? Well, then turn toward God. Orient yourself toward God in humility. Just like you need to do if you want to know another person. Empty yourself of preconceptions. Look for the good. Just like you need to do if you want to know trigonometry. And Jesus puts a really fine point on this in the gospel today. I love these stories when the disciples are walking along and they're being all petty, you know? They're squawking at each other about who's best, who's most important. And Jesus knows that this is what they're talking about. And he says, what are you guys talking about? And, you know, people will be very big and boastful when they're talking to each other. And then, you know, whatever, the teacher or the boss or the parent asks, what are you talking about? And all of a sudden they get real quiet. And that's what happens. The disciples don't want to say, oh, we were talking about who in our group of 12 dudes is the most important. You know, they didn't want to own up to it. But Jesus knows. And so Jesus decides to illustrate something for them. He says that if you want to be great, you got to really start at the bottom. You've got to acquire the greatness of service. In other words, you got to not seek it. You got to seek the good of the other person. And then, to really illustrate the point, he does something really profound. They're in a house with a household, with a family, and he invites a child into the center of their circle. And he takes the child in his arms, and he says, you want greatness, you got to welcome the child. Child who can't do anything for you, child who can't instruct you in any wisdom, child who can't proclaim anything to you. You've got to welcome the child. And the one who welcomes the child will be welcoming me. And the one who welcomes me will be welcoming my Father who sent me. Jesus is saying, I am embodied in the child that you welcome, and my Father is embodied in me. And if you want to be great, you've got to start there. If you want to be great, you have to show it with your love. So today I want to focus just for a minute on our third core value, which is in your bulletin and it's on your sermon response sheet today, that we pursue our faith with curiosity. We love to learn. We welcome new ideas, new people, and new perspectives on our faith and our world. And I especially have been thinking about those verbs, pursue and welcome. Because one of the things that I've always loved about this community, from more than 5 years ago when I was first reading the paperwork and talking to the call committee, one of the things I've always loved is that people really are eager to learn about their faith here. There is genuine curiosity, excitement, eagerness to discover more. And so as a pastor, I know that I can talk about church history, I can talk about the scriptures, I can talk about theology, and I can even raise challenging questions without people freaking out. Because people like to learn. The idea of the Christian faith is a dialogue with different voices, different points of emphasis. That's not a scandal or a problem here. The idea that the scriptures can contain different, even seemingly contradictory elements that are in conversation with one another is not a crisis in this church. And what this means for me personally is that I am free to confess my own ignorance, and I am free to confess my own lack of certainty when I encounter it, which is very often. And, more importantly, it means that we always have more truth to pursue. I don't believe that God changes or that the gospel evolves over time. I think the gospel that was true in the first century is the same today. But I don't think that you ever fully know God. And the meaning of that good news, that Jesus Christ was born and lived and died and was raised from the dead for your salvation, the meaning of that good news always changes and always gets disclosed to us in new ways. Christianity is not like an online exam with a percentage complete bar at the bottom. Go, I'm 50% done learning God. We always have further to go. We always have more to pursue. And likewise, it matters that we strive to welcome children. The preschool, of course, is a big ministry here. And we are more closely related to it than I think a lot of people may be aware of. Eliana and I spend, at least one of us is with the whole preschool every week, and we spend time with the teachers and the staff and support the parents in the faith formation of the children through worship and other outreach. But we also have a strong tradition of welcoming children in worship here on Sunday, just as Jesus says to do. I think that's really important. I think that's enormously important, in fact. That this congregation is better than average, in my experience, at embracing, welcoming the tiny measure of chaos that a small child can bring. And I love reassuring parents on this point, saying it's fine, bring your kid to church, it's going to be fine. In fact, it's more important that people in worship hear your child's voice than that they hear mine. And I mean that. That's exactly what Jesus tells us today. Because, and this is important, I want you to remember this part. If you forget everything else, please remember this part. Because welcoming a child is welcoming your own ignorance. And welcoming a child is welcoming your own love. What Jesus says today with this child among his disciples is not just the child is the object of their concern, but the child is exemplar of what it means to live with that openness toward God, to have no choice but to be open to what the world is going to teach you, to have no way to interact with that world but your own love, to start with that, to have no pride, to have no sort of overwhelming, overbearing desire to domineer, but to start with that most basic primal need. What is this world? What makes it tick? Who is here with me? Those are questions that begin from that most basic place of a desire to know something we don't know. And that most basic place, that most basic yearning to become acquainted with something we have not met. And those are gifts that come from God. And they are gifts that we nurture. And they are gifts whose fulfillment is always out ahead of us, but whose hope always pulls us forward. Amen.